Hello, everyone. Welcome and good afternoon. I'm Kim Johnson, Policy Manager with the National Low Income Housing Coalition. We are going to give it just another minute for folks to log on, and then we'll go ahead and get started. We have a wonderful call set up for you today, so really looking forward to it. Thanks for joining. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. I'm Kim Johnson, Policy Manager with the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and this is, of course, our bi-weekly National HoUSed campaign call for universal, stable, and affordable housing. I am delighted to be hosting this call today. We have a fantastic lineup ahead. We're going to hear from Alex HoUSed, Project Director of the Housing Policy Initiative at Pew Charitable Trust, who will discuss new research on the connection between housing cost and homelessness. We'll be joined by Chi-Chi Wu, Senior Staff Attorney at the National Consumer Law Center, who will provide an update on some recent administrative action taken against TransUnion for their background check practices. We're going to hear some updates from our partners in Nevada, Delaware, and Texas, and we'll close out with the latest updates from Capitol Hill. So let's jump on in and get started. First up, I am happy to introduce Alex HoUSed, Project Director of the Housing Policy Initiative at Pew Charitable Trust. Alex, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey, Kim. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me. We are doing research at Pew and sharing it with policymakers and media on housing issues. We're focused on housing affordability, and especially those issues affecting low and moderate income households. So there's been a lot happening at the city level, at the state level, around housing policy changes. And so what can we learn from those changes? One of the areas that we're focused on is homelessness. And when we're looking at homelessness, we're really looking at it from a very high level, thinking about housing markets, housing dynamics, rather than about specific interventions, and looking at how homelessness levels change over time in response to policy changes. So let's jump to the first slide here. So we published research in August, and that's going to be the basis for the short presentation today. But to summarize it quickly, we're seeing really different rent trajectories in the US, depending on how much housing there is in a market and how much demand there is in a market. And so some places are seeing their rents rise while other places are seeing them fall. And we see that in places where rents have increased, homelessness is increasing also. And places where rents are already high have high levels of homelessness. So the existing academic research is awfully clear in this area. Study after study finds that it is housing costs that are driving homelessness levels, and it is not other factors. So each time that researchers build a model to explain variation in homelessness between cities, between counties, between states, they're finding the same thing. It is housing costs driving homelessness. And far and away, that housing costs have the most explanatory power, far more than any other variable. So researchers usually express that in academic terms, so focused on R-squareds, focused on p-values, building coefficients. And so we're looking at what this looks like in dollars and in rent changes over time, and what is explaining changes in rents and what is explaining changes in homelessness. Let's go to the next slide. So we see that rent trajectories are not the same everywhere. This covers the last 5 years. So we chose this time period to align with the PIT counts from HUD and see over the exact same time period what was happening to rents. And so this is rent changes. 6 cities in orange on the left have seen rents rise faster than the US overall. 4 cities in blue on the right have seen rents rise much slower than the US overall. We break them up into these 2 groups because we want to see how rents are tracking with homelessness. And even though the academic research is very clear that this is happening, I wanted to show what this looks like in practice. Let's go to the next slide. And so you can see what's happened with homelessness levels in these cities that have seen very different rent changes. In the places in orange where rents have been rising quickly because there has not been enough housing for the demand that exists in those markets for it, we see homelessness shooting up much, much faster than the US overall, which only had a 4% increase in homelessness during this time period. And this is per capita. So this controls for population size because it's just looking at the homelessness rate, not the number of people experiencing homelessness. That's how we compare cities of different sizes to each other. And then in the places on the right in blue, where homelessness has been dropping, those are the same places that have had slow rent growth. Rent growth in the neighborhood of 2% a year in the cities in blue on the right, while in the cities in orange on the left, rents have been rising much faster than that. In all of them, we've seen media accounts about encampments, and seen media accounts about the sharp rise in homelessness and the devastation that this is bringing to primarily low-income households who have lost housing, and how this is affecting them, how it's affecting their communities, and how hard it is to bounce back from that. We can go forward on the slides. So we looked at places where homelessness was changing and where rents were changing. But also there's the question of not just change, but what is your absolute rent level? And we see that in these cities in blue, we see rents that are very high, San Francisco, New York City, LA, DC, and then rents that are lower, below the national average in Memphis, Milwaukee, Pittsburgh, and Houston. So in the first 4, we were looking at the change over time. And in this one, we're looking at absolute levels, just how high are rents. And let's go to the next slide. And we see dramatic disparities in homelessness levels. So 19 times as much homelessness per capita in San Francisco as in Houston. New York City, more than 10 times the homelessness level per capita as in Pittsburgh. So this is consistent with the research that's found that rents are the primary driver of homelessness and not other factors. And we can see what this looks like in practice. If it were individual factors driving homelessness, we wouldn't be seeing these results. Obviously, there are states that have been hit very hard by the opioid epidemic. There are states that have high poverty rates. That's not where we see the highest levels of homelessness. Where we see the highest levels of homelessness is where rents are the highest. So we wanted to look both at just high rents, high homelessness, low rents, low homelessness. We see that correlation, but also the change over time. So we can be confident it is the rents that are driving this and not some other factor. Because when a place sees rents that are flat, rents that are declining, we see homelessness dropping. When we see places where rents are shooting up, we see homelessness rising quickly. So let's go to the next slide. So now that we've covered the fact that, hey, right, this is rents. Housing costs are the primary driver of homelessness. This is what's driving homelessness. That may be intuitive. So how do we slow the growth of housing costs? You probably know that 50 years ago, the United States had very, very little homelessness, really a trivial amount. And homelessness exploded as rents rose, as zoning got more restrictive, and as the US began building much less housing than it had before, and as there was really a drop-off in low-cost housing, as cities especially zoned out the lowest cost apartments. So we see that lower housing costs, lower homelessness got that. And so then how do we get to lower housing costs? Well, more supply has been very effective at slowing the growth of housing costs. And we'll see what that looks like here with the next slide. So we looked, so we see from apartment list data that vacancies, which are a really good proxy for housing availability, track very closely with rents. So when there's less housing available, meaning vacancy rates are low, there's more competition for every unit. This is where we see groups at different income levels competing with each other for the same units because there aren't enough homes for everyone. And this artificial scarcity with low vacancy rates causes rents to shoot up. And that's what we're seeing in the apartment list data here. Let's go to the next slide. Some cities have been experimenting with allowing more housing and especially allowing more apartments. And the idea is that if they allowed more apartments, and then builders will build them because they won't be prohibited by local zoning anymore. And if that happens, then that should improve affordability because there should be additional homes out there. And so we'll see, we'll see that allowing more homes in a market will slow down rent growth. Minneapolis added 8% to its housing stock over this 5-year period that the US only added 3%. New Rochelle, New York added 12%, Portland, Oregon, 7%, Tyson's 23%. So they've all added housing at more than double the rate of the US over this 5-year period. We studied rents rose 30% in the US in that time period. They didn't rise more than 5%. This is total, not per year, total over this time period that we tracked rent growth. And all 4 of these jurisdictions added households at a faster rate than the US. So it's not low demand, explaining this change, explaining this difference between the US. They held rent growth down because they allowed housing, especially apartments, which cost less. Let's go to the next slide. And so how does this track with homelessness? Well, we looked at rent growth and homelessness in the previous study focused on homelessness. You see the left-hand column here, we're adding homes added. How much housing did these places add? So Phoenix and Tucson added a lot less housing than Houston and Minneapolis over this time period. And so we see that rents shot up in Phoenix and Tucson. They were contained in Houston and Minneapolis. Homelessness dropped in Houston and Minneapolis. It shot up in Phoenix and Tucson. The big difference between them is that Houston and Minneapolis made it easy to build during these years. They welcomed apartments and they got more homes. Phoenix and Tucson, even though there was a lot of demand, and Arizona added over 350,000 residents since 2017, they did not add enough homes. They've added fewer homes than they've added people. Their population has increased by more than their housing stock. And so rent growth and homelessness shot up because they didn't have enough homes there. They've made it harder to build. Than Houston and Minneapolis, they have more restrictive zoning. Let's go to the next slide. So the effect in Houston's added 33% to its housing stock since 2000. The 4th biggest city in the US. The biggest 3, New York, LA, Chicago, have added less housing, an average of 14%. New York, LA, Chicago have all lost Black residents during this time period, and they've added Hispanic residents at a much lower rate than Houston. Houston added Black residents as well during this time period. Adding to its housing stock, even though Houston's the 4th biggest city, job-rich city's been adding jobs, it has seen much slower rent growth, and that has kept down its homelessness level in addition to concerted efforts it's made. And we see that it has been able to fight off displacement of Black and Hispanic residents of color, by allowing more housing and increasing its housing stock, adding 33% during this time period. And that has dramatically improved affordability, where a middle-income household can buy a home in Houston, and that is obviously not true in New York, LA, and Chicago, in the city with their housing prices. Let's go to the next slide. That's my contact info. Feel free to reach out if I can share more. We have follow-up studies coming out on this topic, and excited to be here with you and take questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Alex. And thank you for obviously joining us, but for also your work at the Housing Initiative at Pew. We love your research and always find it very, very helpful. A few questions that popped up in the Q&A, and audience members, please feel free to drop more questions in the Q&A. A really good one that I see is the relationship between housing cost and homelessness. Does that hold for rural communities as well?
So the hold for rural communities as well. We didn't break out rural communities, but I can say that there's enough data here that it holds for rural states. So the biggest increase in homelessness in the US since 2020 has been in Vermont and Maine. Vermont and Maine saw an influx of residents from other states when COVID hit, and they've both made changes. Vermont made big ones this legislative session to allow more housing, but at the time, jurisdictions in Vermont and Maine were mostly not making it easy to build housing. They did not add much to their housing stock during that time period and had rules preventing them from doing so. And they both saw homelessness more than double. And those states saw the biggest rise in homelessness in the country, both predominantly rural.
Fascinating. Thank you, Alex. A couple other questions that have come in. One from Monica. Several housing providers use an online or computer program to determine how many units to withhold from the market and the rate they can charge depending on how many units are withheld. Will building more supply help solve that tactic?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the company that was flagged, yeah, that is used in lots of markets. And so we looked at, Houston, Minneapolis, Chicago, Philly, places that have held rent growth quite low. Companies like that are used in those places too. And so it's the difference between them is not whether a company like that is used. And even there, I mean, yes, that's a real issue that you're flagging about using companies to try and maximize rents across companies. But they're looking at vacancy rates that really are in the mid 90s. And so making decisions to calibrate between a percentage point or two, now that can matter. I'm not saying that that's nothing, but there's overwhelming evidence at this point that allowing more homes, especially lower cost homes like apartments, is really effective, even when companies like that are being used as software providers by landlords.
Fascinating. And relatedly, Andy asks, how does the high cost of housing impact this equation? Noting that, the idea of trickle-down housing has not and does not really work.
Yeah, so great point. And I think that there's a question about whether new housing coming online, does it only help affordability when it gets old, right, and reaches low and moderate income households? I don't see that. I think you're right. That's not at all what's happening. It's not that housing comes online and when it's 20, 30 years old, then it starts to cost less and lower income households can get it then. So building now really doesn't do anything for a long time. I think you're right. That's not what's going on. What's going on is by allowing more housing in a market, we reduce competition between rich, moderate income, and low income households. When high income and low income households compete for the same units, we know who wins. High income households win because they have more money and they can pay more for the units. But we only really see that competition between high income and low income households when there's a shortage, when there's artificial scarcity. Today, the median rent to income ratio in the US is about 30%. It's an all-time high. That's not normal. Normally, rent to income ratios are in the low 20s. The number of households paying 30% or more of their income for rent is double today, the historical norm. What's different now is that we have the biggest housing shortage that we've had. We're short 4 to 7 million homes because we've made it hard to build. And this shortage is doing the most damage to households of color and to low-income households.
Fantastic. Thank you, Alex. And I think we'll have time for just one more questions, but there are just a couple that are popping up. So Alex, if you have time, would love for you to stick around and write some answers, but if not, we'll follow up with you. So one last question is kind of a joint. So did your study include other cities? And I've seen a lot of interest in participants who would love to see the data that you all were using and would love to know more about, how you determined which cities to look at, all of that good stuff.
Sure. Yeah, glad to do that. And this is all publicly available data. There's nothing proprietary here. We matched up apartment list rents, and we matched them up by jurisdiction and over time periods with the homelessness data released by HUD through the point in time count that they publish, which I'm looking forward to the new one coming out, hope this month. And we can match them up with each other. So all publicly available data, nothing proprietary. And we can run these numbers for other jurisdictions also. It takes a little time, But that's something we can put together if there's interest. And I mentioned we're going to have some follow-ups coming off of this, looking at the experiences between different places and changes in homelessness over time, because we recognize that we had almost no homelessness 50 years ago and we could get there again.
Yes, we can. Thank you so much, Alex, for joining, and we'll have to have you back as your work on this issue keeps evolving. So we'll look forward to inviting you back.
Great, thanks so much.
Thank you. So next up, I would like to welcome Chi-Chi Wu, Senior Staff Attorney at the National Consumer Law Center. Chi-Chi, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us.
Thank you, Kim, for having me join you. And thank you, Alex, for a brilliant and insightful presentation. I'm based here in Boston, Massachusetts, where we have some of the highest housing costs in the nation, and definitely can see the impact that high rents have on homelessness. And I'm going to talk about something that makes the rent even higher and even more unaffordable for a lot of tenants, and that's junk fees. So this is just quickly a plug. As some of you may know, the Biden administration has engaged in this all-out effort to combat junk fees in lots of different industries. So you may have heard about their efforts to combat junk fees in airline tickets and concert tickets, hotels, etc. Well, one of the industries where there's a lot of junk fees as well is rental housing. You may have seen it yourselves in your own cities, things like application fees, pest control fees, even things like valet trash fees for taking out the trash, or our personal favorite, January fees, a fee charged because it was January. So as part of this effort to combat junk fees, the Federal Trade Commission has issued a proposed rule. This rule would require that all businesses disclose a total price for goods and services that's inclusive of fees. The idea is you get an all-in price tag, so you know what you're paying. And for renters, that would mean when you get a total price for rent, this is how much each month you're going to pay. It's a great rule. It's a strong rule. It's very broad. It covers all industries and businesses. And the FTC is asking for comments on it. And we are urging housing advocates and renters to comment on rental junk fees. We've created a landing page right here on the slide that will give you a little bit of background information and some suggestions on how to put together a comment, very simple comment letter. And the reason we're urging comments in particular is that there is one question that the FTC asks in the sort of the explanation of the proposed rule that asks, should this rule cover all businesses or just certain businesses, such as hotels and concerts and airlines? And we want to urge the FTC to not only cover rental housing as one of these industries, but also to cover as many industries as possible. So please check out the landing page and file comments and urge your constituencies to. So that's the junk fee proposed rule and comments. Next slide, please. So what I wanted to spend the most time today talking about is the CFPB and FTC's action against TransUnion. So the CFPB, Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and the Federal Trade Commission, FTC, took enforcement action against TransUnion for its tenant screening product. So most people think of TransUnion, they think of credit reports, credit scores, the things used to determine whether you can get credit or not. But TransUnion actually has a tenant screening product, TransUnion Rental Screening Solutions. This is similar to other rental tenant screening products, RealPage, the company mentioned earlier in the call that also has a program to set rents, Appfolio, Safe Rent Solutions. These are all companies engaged in tenant screening used by landlords to get reports on a potential tenant, consisting usually of credit information, eviction records, and criminal records. This particular enforcement action against TransUnion had to do with eviction records. And the two big allegations were that TransUnion failed to follow reasonable procedures to assure maximum possible accuracy of the eviction records in its tenant screening reports. And that's the statutory standard, reasonable procedures to assure maximum possible accuracy. That's the accuracy required under the Federal Fair Credit Reporting Act. So what was TransUnion doing that was so inaccurate? Well, it would do things like take one eviction record and report it 2 or 3 times to make it look like the tenant had more than one eviction case against them. And obviously that would hurt the tenant even more when they're trying to apply for an apartment. Did not accurately report eviction case disposition. So as you know, often with eviction proceedings, an eviction proceeding will be filed, but then it'll be dismissed or there'll be a settlement. It might have been wrongfully filed. And what would happen was TransUnion would report the filing and not the disposition. And so it would make the tenant look worse in the eyes of potential landlords. Related to this, it did not accurately label data fields in eviction records. This basically means, the big one here was judgment amounts. So they had this field called judgment amounts, and they would include in that field not only the actual court judgment in an eviction case, but sometimes simply what the landlord was seeking in the complaint, or what the landlord thought the tenant should have paid. And then finally, TransUnion did not prevent the inclusion of sealed eviction records. The other big category of violations is that go back to the last slide. When consumers got their own reports from TransUnion, the reports failed to identify that the source of a lot of this information was not the court itself, but LexisNexis. LexisNexis often acts as a vendor of public records like eviction records. And this is important because if there's something erroneous in a report and the consumer or renter is trying to dispute it, knowing that there's a third party LexisNexis involved is important so they can go to the source of the error. Okay, next slide now. So this was a action that was filed along with a consent order. So basically at the same time the complaint was filed, the settlement agreement was filed. And in the settlement agreement, the TransUnion agreed to some remedies in terms of what it was going to do going forward, as well as some monetary relief. In terms of going forward conduct, TransUnion has agreed not to violate the Fair Credit Reporting Act again by engaging in the conduct complained about, but also agreed to have written procedures designed to prevent including sealed records, any eviction record that doesn't have a final outcome. So TransUnion is not going to be reporting the filing of a complaint in eviction complaint records anymore, just eviction records where there's a judgment or some sort of final outcome against the tenant. It's going to avoid multiple filings for the same eviction proceeding. It's going to only include the most recent filing, like a judgment, or if the judgment is satisfied or released, the satisfaction or release. And in that field about money judgment, final judgment or judgment amounts, it's only going to include actual judgment amounts or amounts that reflect a full or partial satisfaction, i.e. a payment by the renter in satisfaction of the judgment. Next slide, please. Money. TransUnion is paying money for all of these transgressions. $11 million in redress. So that means $11 million to compensate renters that were harmed by these practices. If you have clients that you think were affected by these practices, there's going to be a redress plan that requires TransUnion to identify renters affected by this and to send them payments. Unfortunately, I've been told the redress plan itself might not be public, but some of the things in the consent order and that I've heard or thought about in terms of helping tenants make sure they get their redress is to make sure that the client's address is up to date. TransUnion is supposed to be using the post office's change of address database. So make sure if your client has moved that they're in that database, have them pull their TransUnion report and see what the address is shown on their TransUnion credit report, because presumably TransUnion is going to use its own credit reports to figure out where people live. So make sure that address is up to date. And then there's a $4 million civil penalty. Next slide, please. One thing I wanted to flag is that the issue about sealed or expunged records. Our position has been, and I believe the CFPB's position is now, that records that have been sealed or expunged should not be included in tenant screening reports or criminal background check reports. But there's never been anything definitive about that. And we're hoping that there will be definitive guidance issued at some point. But when the CFPB issued the press release and information about its action against TransUnion rental screening solutions, it did issue consumer-facing guidance. And the guidance does say, have a question, are sealed and expunged records being included in your tenant screening report? And it says, if your eviction was sealed or expunged, so it should not be on your report. So here is a statement by CFPB. Sealed or expunged records should not be in a tenant screening or criminal background check report. And that's important because the CFPB is the administrative agency that is supposed to interpret the Fair Credit Reporting Act, which is the law that was violated in this enforcement action and which governs tenant screening. This is a strong consent order or a settlement agreement by TransUnion. It's got some important protections. If you have clients and you see that their tenant screening reports are still reflecting things that shouldn't be in it, like a sealed or expunged record, or the filing an eviction record without a final disposition, they should definitely file a dispute, file a complaint with the CFPB. So with that, I want to see if folks had any questions about either the CFPB and FTC's enforcement action against TransUnion rental screening solutions or the FTC's junk fee proposed rule.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Chi-Chi. That was an incredibly helpful overview of a very complex topic, but also one that I think a lot of people really relate to, just the idea of all of these junk fees on things driving up the cost of everything from housing to concert tickets. So really appreciate your overview of that. One question that came in through the Q&A, do junk fees include those related to those incurred to allocate utilities like water, sewer, trash, and electricity among tenants based on household and or bedroom size or number of bathrooms?
So the proposed rule actually doesn't call them junk fees. It just covers fees or costs and says that a business, which in this case would be the housing provider, must give a total price to the consumer, in this case, the renter. And so there should be a total price for rent, which includes all of the fees. It also prohibits misleading fees. So let's say there's a fee for a service that's not being offered, like, I don't know, valet trash, where it's like you just have to take your trash to the trash bin like everybody else, and there's no valet involved. That might be a misleading fee, and that it prohibits that. There are going to be complicated issues. For example, we're not quite sure how the rule is going to deal with application fees, because a lot of times you pay an application fee and you don't get the apartment. So how does that get disclosed as a total price of something? And I think utility fees are going to be something that is included in this category of needing further clarification. How do you disclose utility fees that are going to be included in the rent and that may vary on usage?
Great, thank you. Another question, do we know if the FTC comment portal will allow for private comments, or will all comments be posted publicly?
So the FTC comment portal, it's being filed through regulations.gov, which is the federal government's portal in general. The portal is public. All comments get posted on regs.gov. There are sometimes anonymous comments I've seen on regulations.gov. You can email a comment in. So, I actually have not ever tried to file something anonymously, so I don't know how well it works, but I have seen anonymous comments.
Great. And then a question from Monica, can we get a list of TransUnion screening tool users? Is there any way is there any system tracking who is using, these tools really?
Unfortunately, that is a very tricky issue. One of the big issues in tenant screening is, tenant screening is not like credit reports where there's the big three companies, Experian, Equifax, TransUnion, and that a lot of lenders use all three, like mortgage lenders, or that if you're going to buy something else, or you're getting credit from somewhere else, like an auto deal or a credit card, you just check all three reports. There are a lot more than 3 tenant screening companies, and it's often unclear a landlord, uses which one. We don't know. There is a right to get your own tenant screening report from these companies. And if it's a nationwide screening company like TransUnion or like SafeRent or AppFolio, you have the right to pull your own report for free. It's not through annualcreditreport.com. It's through their toll-free number or website, but renters have a right to a free annual report.
That's great. And also a fact that often gets lost too in tenant screening. And then a final question for you, Chi-Chi. Are background check fees included in the FTC junk fee project?
So the FTC junk fee proposed rule, as proposed, so it's not final, it could change, as proposed covers all industries, all fees. And those fees are supposed to be included in a total price. Unfortunately, as I said, things like application fees, and often application fees are used to cover things like background check fees plus more, sometimes a lot more. It's unclear how the rule is going to be dealing with them, and that's one of the issues we're going to raise. So either, background check fees directly charged to the renter or included in application fees is something that's going to be needed to be dealt with.
Great. Thank you so much, Chi-Chi, for joining us today and for that incredibly helpful overview. We really appreciate it, and we'll look forward to hearing more about, what the FTC ends up doing with this new proposed rule.
Great. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. All right, so we will turn now to our updates from the field. First, we have Katrina Grigsby Thedford, Executive Director of the Nevada Homelessness Alliance. Katrina, welcome.
Hi. Okay, let me get my camera cut on. And so thank you so much for having me here. So on November 21st, a couple weeks ago, we hosted our Project Homeless Connect event here in Las Vegas. It was our 31st annual event. Previously, we called it the Homeless Stand Down until we adopted Project Homeless Connect in 2007. And as you guys may or may not know, our homeless numbers, just like the rest of multiple communities, continue to increase. From last year's point in time count to this year, there were over 900 new homeless individuals in our community right here in Southern Nevada. So at our Project Homeless Connect event, of course, if you don't know about Project Homeless Connect, is a one-stop resource fair where we have multiple community partners, as well as employment agencies, legal agencies, housing agencies, medical, dental, and vision, clothing, showers, all the works there is a one-stop shop for individuals who are experiencing homelessness or who are at risk of homelessness to get those on-the-spot services. So we assisted 788 people, but when you include the children and the other members of the families, there were about 1,194. The biggest majority of individuals who attended were between the ages of 25 and 54. But there were about 237 people who were over 55, and of that, 112 were 62 years or older. So we see our senior population of those experiencing homelessness continuing to increase in our community as well. We assisted about 50 veterans. We gave out over 1,000 bus passes in our medical, dental, and vision section. We had our Las Vegas eye doctors there, and they saw 74 individuals who got eye exams, free prescriptions, not free prescriptions, but prescriptions that were in line with who their MCO is. So we had all of our managed care organizations there so that if individuals didn't know, they can go visit a booth to see who they have so they can get their prescriptions or reading glasses. We had a dental school there that did dental examinations of 57 people. And then the next week they closed their office for one day to do all follow-up appointments of individuals they saw at Projects Homeless Connect. There were over 120 pets that were groomed, which is always awesome, and over 50 vaccinations. We have some local some pet clinics that donate their time every year at our event to make sure our pets that are experiencing homelessness with their humans are taken care of. We did something different this year. So we, of course, all communities have the coordinated entry, the housing assessment, but we linked it to our housing problem solving. We believe that individuals, Nevada Homeless Alliance believe that individuals shouldn't be their needs shouldn't be indicated by numbers. So in our community, we are really pushing housing problem solving conversations, those one-on-one conversations with individuals to see what their barriers or challenges are to kind of help them determine or brainstorm who those social, financial, connections that they haven't tapped into yet, so that we just won't have a really, really long waiting list for housing. And some people are able to self-resolve with some prompting and correct questions. So our coordinated entry, we saw 195 people, about 115 check-ins, and 80 of those people were referred to a housing problem solving section, where we had multiple people from different agencies who were trained in housing problem solving by a professional trainer. We have some flexible funds in our community. And out of those 80 people who were referred to housing problem solving, about 10 of them went to a U.S. Vets Betterment program, which is a program for non-veterans. We did 12 tickets to home. We were able to contact that family member in the host city to confirm everything. We utilized housing problem solving flex funds for a lot of this. There were 24 people transported to shelter beds, and we have a navigation center as well here. About 8 people went there. So out of those 80 people referred to housing problem solving, about 64 total clients were connected directly to housing, may it be shelter, going out of state with their family member, going into a transitional program, or have funds to assist them from eviction. There were over 195 haircuts, and a lot of people got IDs and birth certificates. So the last thing is that we did an exit survey, and about 55% of the people were seeking housing, 31% clothing, hygiene, and shower, and about 30% were seeking healthcare. When we asked people what services were unavailable, about 16% said housing, 6% healthcare, and 5% legal. A majority of the individuals, over 50%, said that their overall wellness was improved after receiving the services. 36% of the individuals who were surveyed that came to the event were residing in a homeless shelter, and 27% were unsheltered and homeless. So we also did some surveys for people who are unsheltered, and we provided incentives for participating in the survey, and about 30% lost their housing because of loss of employment, 15% due to eviction, 8% released from jail or prison. We had some who were fleeing domestic violence and loss of government assistance. And when it comes down to the thing they say could end their homelessness, 36% said affordable housing, 31% said employment, and then 8% said a support system. And so we were really excited to implement some of these new surveys so we can get some information from the people who are actually experiencing unsheltered homelessness, as well as people who are at risk of homelessness. And so we're just always in our community collaborating and trying to make sure that we provide on-the-spot services. We are funded by HoUSed, and we will start doing 2 events per week in our community starting in January, directly at homeless shelters, encampments, church parking lots, and things like that. So we can be boots on the ground and get these people the services they need on the spot. Thank you for inviting me today.
That is such incredible work that you all are doing. Katrina, thank you so much for all of the care and thoughtfulness that you put into taking care of unhoused people in your community and making sure that everybody is, receiving the services that they need. It looks like we don't have any questions in the chat, but I do have one for you.
Yes, ma'am.
We had Alex on earlier talking about the connection between homelessness and rising rental costs. And I was just wondering, what does that situation look like for you all in Nevada? Because I know from NLHC's research that Nevada has some of the most urgent affordable housing needs of any state in the country.
Yeah, so we are now called a suburb of LA. So a lot of people from other states and cities are moving to Las Vegas. We have a lot of people purchasing properties, and rents are dramatically increasing. And so, even if an individual is in a program, the landlords are still wanting the client to have 3 times the rent. So we run into that a lot. We have a lot of traction with our moms and pops landlords, and some of the landlords through our landlord engagement that are able and willing to work with us. But a majority of the new landlords here are increasing rents, and people are being priced out. They're not accepting, we have the source of income discrimination that's going on, not accepting vouchers and things like that. And so so it is a big problem. We have people enrolled in programs, but yet when we look at fair market rent versus what the actual rent is, it's pretty hard to house individuals when they don't have that other discretionary funding to put on the back end to ensure that the full rent could be covered. So it continues to be an issue right here in Southern Nevada, just like the rest of the country.
Definitely. A couple questions that came in for you, and a lot of love in the chat for all of the excellent work that you're doing. A question, can you share information on the housing problem solving model or training?
So our housing problem solving, so we, along with HoUSed TA in our community, we are working on making sure that, so housing problem solving could be a diversion conversation, it could be an eviction prevention conversation, it could be a conversation with a person experiencing that housing crisis that kind of assists the person with tapping into what other networks or contacts they may have in the community to help them self-resolve. So, often it's like, oh, a person shows up at a shelter, we look at your HMIS ID, we give you a bed, you're kicked out the next morning, you're homeless again. So we're trying to implement that no wrong door, that we're going to be having housing problem solving conversations with people just to see where they are. So they could entail calling a host family if they're staying with someone, contacting that landlord, helping them link with people in their church, or knowing exactly what's in the community so that we can know exactly what they qualify for. Because of course we can do a housing assessment, they'll be on this list and coordinated entry. We have to wait for a matcher to match them to the agency. And often in our system, the most vulnerable are prioritized. And so if an individual becomes homeless tomorrow or next week, and they were recently housed, they're gonna age into chronicity, right? By the time their name is called. So we want to be able to have those conversations, those empathetic, person-centered conversations with individuals who are experiencing homelessness for the first time, long time, at risk of homelessness, all that, because often we're able to link them to resources that could assist them with that crisis in the moment.
Fantastic. And one last question, then we'll let you go. So my wonderful colleague Sid asked in the Q&A, hi Katrina, it was such an honor to volunteer at this year's project Homelessness Connect. I know Sid's wonderful.
Yes.
Can you share more about how the procurement worked for this event so that others can learn how to replicate it in their communities?
So since we've been having our event for so many years in the community, we're very known in the community. So this event is a once per year fall event. Back in the day, we used to serve over 2,000 people at these events. So Nevada Homeless Alliance now, and since I became the executive director, we have about 4 events per month. So we work closely with the elected officials. We work closely with businesses, all the community centers, libraries, everybody. So when we're ready to have an event in a location that's highly populated with people experiencing homelessness, people know who we are and they know that we're coming to serve people, right? So if you don't want homeless people experiencing homelessness in your area, like the best policy would be to allow us to come and use your parking lot or the parking lot across the street to provide some on-the-spot services. So this year we had a location secured since April. They canceled on us about a month before the event, and we were able to reach out to our elected officials and say, hey, we're in need of a location to serve over 1,000 people. And they just got to it, found us a location. So it's all about connection, just collaboration, and just, not working in silos in the community. That's how we're able to get things done. And the community center was more than willing to close up for us that day of the event, because normally it's hard to close a community center because of after school programs and senior programs, but they were able to accommodate us. And we're just extremely grateful that our community works together like that, and our elected officials have our back and are, wanting to serve our most vulnerable neighbors as well.
Fantastic. Really a testament to the importance of having those relationships and having elected officials who will have your back in situations like that.
Absolutely.
Really incredible work. Thank you so much, Katrina, for joining
Thank
us,
you.
and we'll look forward to having you back again soon.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. And so I would now like to welcome Sonia Starr, Policy Director at Housing Alliance Delaware. Sonia, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for having me. I do appreciate it. If you want to switch to my slides.
Ooh, Sonia, it looks like you might be frozen. Give her just a second to see if she pops back on. That's coming through frozen for other folks too, not just me, right? Oh, oh gosh. Okay.
Did you lose me?
We did for just a second, but you're back now, so that's exciting.
I'm sorry.
No problem.
My internet has been a problem all day. Can I go? I'm wondering if I should go off video.
Yeah, sure. Just in case it helps with bandwidth, we'll be able to hear you just fine.
Sorry about that. So what we have been doing for Faith and Housing Justice Weekend, this is only the second year I brought this to Delaware. It's an opportunity for faith communities to truly engage in different forms of housing instability, depending on what they're seeing in the community in ways that meet their needs. If you don't mind, please going to the next slide. The purpose is to allow the community to allow the community education over the affordable housing crisis, to make connections between the different communities. For example, connections between Code Purple in Delaware or cold weather events in Maryland. They call them in different things. Faith communities do a lot of benevolent work around housing, but they don't always do a lot of advocacy work. And so what we do is we take those communities that know how to do collections of clothes, collections of food, provide housing for a week, those kinds of things, and make a connection between. They also have to do the advocacy work. We do the education about it's legal and how they can do it legally. And then we also develop connections to faith communities that want to do advocacy work throughout the year and increase the number of housing advocates that we have in our community. So that's the purpose that we have for Faith and Housing Justice Weekend. And like I said, it's the second year. So before we show you the next slide of the first year and then the second year, remember Delaware is the second smallest state in the country. We only have slightly over 1 million people in the whole state. So the numbers will look small for some of the places, but percentage-wise, the growth is pretty cool. So go to the next slide, please. So last year, we only had 4 faith communities, and still in Delaware last year, we were pretty closed because of COVID. So almost all of them, with one exception, that slide is wrong. It were 3 were virtual, 1 was in person. Most were standard community education. I'm a rabbi, so I wrote the Jewish section with a Protestant minister and a Catholic education professional, as well as a Muslim professional. We wrote an interfaith curriculum that has text, prayer, interfaith prayers, as well as religious specific prayers and texts. And we held the event the first week of December. My standard joke is you don't have somebody Jewish try to connect something to Christmas, because I knew a lot about Christmas, and agencies and faith communities do a lot for people who live on the margins during Christmas, but I didn't know anything about Advent, which is why we only had 4. So that's why we moved it from before Christmas to before Thanksgiving. And it was this year, the second year, it was the weekend before Thanksgiving. Please go to the next slide. I only rewrote the data part of the curriculum, and the only reason that's important is next year I've been asked to update it in other places and add other religious communities, which we will definitely do. We had 12 faith communities instead of 4. And the slide is wrong. I got the last survey today. We had over 1,300 people participate in one way or the other. All 3 Delaware, we only have 3 Delaware counties. All 3 Delaware counties were represented. All were in person, and the variety of activities were huge. And that's really what everybody really was the most excited about. We had a high school program that was intergenerational. We had art programs. We had a Spanish service. We had policy discussions. We had sermons. We had a variety of different kinds of programs. We had one that was, how do you understand homelessness through poetry and music? The other piece of all of that is, remember I said part of my goal is to get them to engage all year round. Every single community of the 12 said they want to do something over the course of the year, and they all said, 100% said they will do it again next year. So I'm really excited about that, and we really see this as an opportunity to continue to grow, get more support, and really utilize it. And for me, the other piece of it that I forgot to say is in Delaware, our session is from January to June. So I want to eventually use this as a lobbying technique, an advocacy technique, that we go in January and say, right before Thanksgiving, X number of faith communities, Y number of people all across the state of Delaware, we're talking about the lack of affordable and safe housing. It's time you do something about it. I don't know if there's a next slide, but you could try. Yes, there is. So lessons to be learned for next year. As I said, the curriculum needs to be updated. So that was another fun one. I really do try to make, not to make the same mistake 2 years in a row. So the mistake this year was I made it before Thanksgiving for a weekend, because in Maryland, the interfaith organizations I knew about did their Thanksgiving service the Sunday before. In Delaware, they do it the Tuesday before. Shame on me for not knowing. So next year, it's going to be the Faith and Housing Justice Week. And at least 4 different communities were part of it the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, even though it was only a weekend. They asked, which is really cool, is to start meeting at the beginning of the summer so they could brainstorm different ideas. And we want to do a significant better job now publicizing the week. And it's been also suggested that we kick off the week with some kind of rally, that should say concert, not concert, sorry. Something either county-based in all 3 counties or something virtual, which really gets the excitement going, maybe gets us a little more press and allows the greater community to participate. And that's the other thing I forgot to say. My only requirements for participating, and we did that, Housing Alliance did a lot of the advertising to the community as a whole, was that it had to do something with homelessness or the lack of affordable and safe housing. It had to be open to the community, and they had to then share with us what they were planning and what happened as a result afterwards. So us doing a better job of publicizing the week to get other non-affiliated people into the doors would be really helpful, and something we've committed to. The other thing I didn't put in the slide, but it's good to know if you're not used to working with the religious community. You know, it's kind of funny. We had the Pew gentleman speaking about Pew earlier. The Pew has done a study that that in the religious community, it is known that institutional participation in places of worship is going down in every single denomination in our country. But one of the things that people who define themselves as spiritual and unaffiliated want is more social justice work that is connected to their spiritual path. So when I talk to faith communities about it, I suggest this also might be outreach for them to unaffiliated people. It makes it a win-win. And then please, the next slide. So that's my contact information. And if anybody has any questions or thoughts or ideas of how to improve it, I'm more than happy to engage. I really think that mining the religious community is a really, really important aspect of housing advocacy period, but including housing advocacy. The other Pew study that's interesting to quote is the largest group of volunteers, the largest groups, the nonprofit groups that actually volunteer in large percentage are still religious communities in this country. So there's no reason they can't be volunteering for advocacy. It's our job to reach out to them. And just because we're secular doesn't mean we can't work with religious communities for them to walk their path in Legislative Hall. Thank you again for inviting me, and I'm glad to answer any questions if there are any.
Thank you so much, Sonia. That was a fantastic presentation. And thank you too for the awesome work that you're doing in Delaware. We always love to have you on and to hear about the work that you all are doing. A couple questions that have come in. One, were any of your elected officials involved in the events this year?
So we did not, there were elected officials that chose to go to events because they found out about them, which was really cool because it made it possible for the faith communities to easily create those relationships, which we were suggesting they could and should. We on purpose did not ask our elected officials to speak because we are in an amazing election year where almost every official is running for re-election, every office. Governor, lieutenant governor, I think it's like 3/4 of the House and half of the Senate. So it would have been impossible to keep it neutral for IRS purposes to get any of the elected officials involved. In a non-election year, we might consider doing that, but in an election year, we didn't know how to do that in a way that would have been respectful of our needs and the faith community's needs.
Very reasonable, and also just really a testament to the thoughtfulness that went behind, planning this whole event. So really just appreciate all of the work that you did. One more question that came in: would you be willing to share the curriculum with others so that they might be able to replicate that event for the faith communities in their areas?
I'd be glad to do it. I do ask that if you utilize it, that there is an attribution comment, because a lot of people went into writing, editing, and stuff like that. If you can make sure we're part of the attribution, and as well as the names of all the people that helped write it, just for the sake of making it clear where it came from, that would be great. But I'm not sure the best way to do that. Would that be for Kim, for me to email it to you?
Yeah, that would be great. Or if folks on the call are interested in reaching out to Sonia directly, her email is right on the screen. So that would be another way of just making sure you get in contact.
Okay, I'll be glad to send it to you as soon as we come off.
Fantastic. And then one more question. Do you have any suggestions for engaging folks who are not religiously affiliated or getting them to, participate in an event like this?
So one of the reasons we went out of our way to have the kinds of diversity in programs that we had was for that reason. So that we on purpose looked for 2 programs that had to do with artistry, hoping that people who were secular might be interested in the arts, even if they weren't interested in religion necessarily. We did the same with the intergenerational program. The policy program was not held, neither was the poetry and music one. They were not held during services, so that somebody could walk into the religious agency, congregation, place of worship and participate, but not have to sit through a service. So we really tried to find that kind of diversity consciously so that other people would feel comfortable coming in. And we definitely had people who said, hey, I'm secular, I'm not even this religion, is it okay that I'm here? And everything's open to the public. You are more than welcome. We're also clear, I should have said that to start with, this is not a proselytizing tool, right? Yes, there's an advantage. These people might want to join the place. That's fine, but they're not utilizing this to proselytize. So people were not to be approached to be proselytized when they came in for the program.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for all of your amazing work, Sonia. We will look forward to having you back to tell us more about what's going on in Delaware.
Thank you.
Thanks again. And last but certainly not least of our fabulous field speakers, we are going to turn it over to Erin Hahn, research analyst for Texas HoUSed. Welcome, Erin, and thank you so much for joining.
Hello, everyone, and thanks, Kim, and to the NLHC for having me today. My name is Erin Hahn. I'm a researcher with Texas HoUSed. We're a nonprofit organization that supports low-income renters' efforts to achieve the American dream of a quality home in Texas. And we do so through research, political advocacy, and coalitional power building. Next slide, please. And so I'm here today to talk about the release of our most recent research project, our interactive Bexar County eviction case dashboard, which my colleague Michael will drop a link to in the chat. The dashboard tracks evictions filed in Bexar County over recent years, and it maps out the geography of filings in 2022. Some context for non-Texans: Bexar County is the county that contains the city of San Antonio. As you can see from the screenshot of the dashboard on the slide, in the top left-hand corner, we've graphed out how the total number of eviction filings changed over the course of 2018 through 2022. In the center of the dashboard, we've mapped eviction filing rates by census tract, or the percentage of a census tract's total renter population that received an eviction filing in 2022. And we identified the top 30 individual rental properties filed the greatest number of evictions in 2022, which are listed on the right hand of the slide, and also identified on the map as red dots. And in a few months, we'll update all of this with 2023 data. Next slide. And so we started this dashboard project earlier this year because there were already online public-facing tools for tracking evictions in Texas' other major cities, including Dallas, Austin, Houston, which were created by other orgs. But there was a gap of missing information regarding the state of evictions in San Antonio. So we decided to create the Bexar County eviction case dashboard so that local leaders and the public could have an understanding of the rate of eviction in our county, and also so state leaders could have a better understanding of the rate of eviction across all of Texas' major cities. Because without data, it's hard to be a part of the conversation. And so we went ahead and submitted a public information request to Bexar County for all eviction records between the years of 2018 and 2022. And we inserted this data into a dashboard that we published to our website. Next slide. And I'll quickly go over some of the findings that came out of the dashboard. But if you click the link that Michael dropped, You'll find much more analysis and discussion in the text that is beneath the dashboard on our website. But first of all, we saw that pandemic era protections like eviction moratoria and rental assistance kept eviction filings extremely low in 2020 and 2021. But when these measures disappeared in 2022, eviction filings in Bexar County quickly skyrocketed back and exceeded pre-pandemic levels. Next slide, please. And eviction filings tended to concentrate in certain neighborhoods, particularly those with high rates of people of color. Next slide. These maps indicate a roughly inverse relationship between evictions and white non-Hispanic households, meaning that evictions tended to be more prevalent in neighborhoods with higher rates of BIPOC households. As you can see in the map on the right, San Antonio is a very racially segregated city. The area boxed in red includes the Alamo Heights, Olmos Park, and Terrell Hills municipalities, which are extremely white and wealthy neighborhoods. And the map on the left shows that this area is largely devoid of eviction filings. Alternatively, San Antonio's west side, which is boxed in green, is predominantly Hispanic or Latino, and the east side, boxed in orange, houses the city's largest Black population. And both these areas have higher rates of eviction. Finally, the area on the northwest side of the county, boxed in yellow, appears on the map to be relatively white. However, this area is actually home to a large population of MENA households, or Middle Eastern and North African households. And because of the way that the US Census collects its data, it inaccurately appears on the map to be white. And this area has a high rate of eviction as well. And so we mapped out evictions in race and ethnicity at the census tract level because the individual eviction records that we collected from Bexar County did not include the race or ethnicity of the tenant being evicted. And it is important to note that if we had case level eviction data with demographic information, we would likely see even greater racial disparities. But mapping out evictions in race and ethnicity data from the census at the neighborhood level definitely illustrates some degree of racial disparity. In that eviction filings appear to be disproportionately impacting neighborhoods with higher rates of people of color. Next slide. We also identified the 30 individual rental properties that filed the most evictions against tenants in 2022, and users can select a property from the list on the right hand of the slide for more information about the property. For example, this complex called Barcelo on the northwest side filed against 47% of its total resident population in 2022, which is quite alarming. The landlord who owns Barcelo, called GVA, along with another landlord who operates in San Antonio called Triff, owned 1/3 of all of the top evicting properties that we looked at. So eviction is not random across San Antonio's rental landscape. It's a tool that's being deployed at a higher rate by select corporate landlords. And in the next phase of our research, which we are starting soon, we're going to do a deeper dive into some of these top evictors in San Antonio and study exactly how eviction fits into their business models. Next slide, please. And so finally, the fact that eviction rates are rising in San Antonio and that select corporate landlords are evicting in huge numbers goes to show the need for eviction prevention measures at both the local and the state level. However, progress at the state level in Texas is notoriously slow. So it is vital for local leaders in San Antonio to prioritize renter stability and fund measures such as right to counsel, tenant-landlord mediation, relocation services, eviction diversion programs, and rental assistance. And then finally, in order to address the root cause of the housing crisis, funding for the construction of more housing units that are affordable to people with the lowest incomes. Next slide. That is it for me. Thank you so much for having me. And I'm happy to answer any questions. And I've also listed my email in case you want to reach out.
Wow. Thank you so much, Erin, for joining us and for bringing us these very sobering statistics. And, this is the rise in eviction filings and eviction rates is an issue that we're seeing all across the country. But I think that Texas HoUSers and the work that you all are doing is really unique in that not everywhere is tracking evictions like you all are, and especially what I find very compelling, the tracking of the various landlords and development companies that are responsible for a lot of these evictions. A question that popped up in the chat, you brought up the need to create this resource for San Antonio. Do you find that what you found in San Antonio is similar to what is being seen in other big Texas cities, and how these findings add to the need for statewide change?
Yeah, what we're seeing in San Antonio in terms of rising eviction rates is pretty equivalent to what we're seeing in Texas' other major cities like Austin and Dallas and Houston. Rents are rising. There's a shortage of affordable housing in all of these cities. The Gap report shows us that more and more households are becoming housing cost burdened and severely housing cost burdened. So yeah, until there's action at the state level, it's unlikely for the situation to get better. But we're seeing that, especially in Texas, the greatest opportunity is for local governments to stand up and pass funding for renter stability and pass protection. So
Totally agree. And also the need for some federal protections in action as well. So one other question that's popped up: how can communities and researchers in other areas replicate some of the findings or replicate, I guess, some of the research that you're doing?
so this was all analysis of data that we collected via a public information request. So I would urge organizations and researchers or advocates on the ground in other areas to ask for similar research or similar data from their counties, their cities, their housing authorities. And I'm happy if anyone wants to reach out, I can provide additional guidance on the language that we used and the process that we used for collecting this data.
Fantastic. I don't see any more questions, so I'll let you go. Thank you so much, Erin, for joining and for all of the incredible work that you're doing in Texas. Until next time, I'm sure that we'll bring you back on again soon. All right, and so we are almost at the tail end of our call, and that brings us to some policy updates from Capitol Hill. If I could get the next slide, please. I threw in just a few to help with sorting through the information I'll be talking about. So as I'm sure a lot of folks on this call know, Congress passed and President Biden signed into law a two-tier stopgap funding bill on November 15th. And that two-tier bill means that some federal programs, including HUD, will receive a funding extension until January 19th, and the remaining programs will be funded until February 2nd. And that CR is meant to give Congress more time to reach a final agreement on FY24 funding, but the possibility remains that members are going to kick the can or the deadline down the road again, which would put us in a pretty bad position for a potential year-long continuing resolution. So year-long continuing resolutions have their own negative impacts on affordable housing, homelessness, and community development programs. Because the cost of housing rises year over year, these programs need funding increases every year just to maintain the current level of services provided to residents and to maintain the number of people being served by those vital programs. Even flat funding, like funding provided through a continuing resolution, acts as a cut and reduces the number of people who are served. However, the terms of the Fiscal Responsibility Act, which is, as a quick reminder, the debt ceiling agreement that Congress made all the way back in June. Under the terms of that bill, if any of the 12 annual spending bills are still operating under a continuing resolution by April 30th, mandatory across the board cuts known as sequestration are going to kick in. And given the drastic increase in the cost of housing over the past year, even a relatively small cut could have very drastic and even dire consequences for the people who are served by HUD's programs. You know, those programs provide funding for, I don't need to tell people on this call, but just to get up on my soapbox quickly, those programs provide funding for people who use it to keep a roof over their heads, to keep, to make sure that their families have a safe place to call home at the end of the day, to help people experiencing homelessness find safe housing. So the idea that there would be any cuts in that vital housing is absolutely unacceptable. So publicly, Congress has really turned its attention to the National Defense Authorization Act and emergency spending supplementals. So we're not seeing a ton of stories in the news about appropriations, but we do know that behind the scenes negotiations over a final FY24 spending bill are still ongoing. And so it's still vital that advocates continue weighing in with their members of Congress on the necessity of increased investments for HUD in FY24. Some of NLHC's priorities include full funding to renew all existing contracts for housing vouchers, both in tenant-based and project-based rental assistance properties. So part of why that is so important, of course, is that without adequate funding, people who rely on housing vouchers could lose their funding or lose the assistance that they rely on. Analysis from our friends at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities showed recently that at the HoUSed allocated funding levels, about 40,000 people would lose their vouchers upon turnover. And to be clear, that's not people who would have their assistance ripped away from them. That's people who, after no longer needing that assistance and turning in their voucher, that voucher would not be reissued. So that would be ultimately a cut in the number of available vouchers, even if people would not lose their assistance who currently rely on it. At the Senate's levels as well, we would see a drop in about, I think, 6,000 vouchers upon turnover. And so neither bill provides adequate funding that we need to see all of those vouchers renewed. So we are pushing for a full renewal of all existing vouchers. We're also pushing for full funding for public housing operations and repairs. We're pushing for the Senate's proposed funding for homeless assistance grants, which help people experiencing homelessness find the resources that they need for safe housing and shelter. We are pushing Congress to protect a $20 million investment in legal services to prevent evictions, which was included in the Senate's draft bill. And we are pushing for the House's proposed funding for Native housing. Native communities have some of the most urgent affordable housing needs in the country, and so we need to see increased resources go to those communities. Obviously, this is very much an uphill battle, and if I could get the next slide too. Thank you. That's all of our, those are all of our priorities. Obviously, this is an uphill battle, but I will say the advocates on this call, the advocates that NLHC works with have done absolutely incredible things in the past. You know, at the beginning of this appropriation cycle, we were staring down up to 30% cuts to HUD funding, and impossibly, we saw an increase in both the House and Senate draft bills. And so it is going to be vitally important that folks continue weighing in with their members to get that funding increase. And it is something that I know that we can do because we have done it before. And if I could get the next slide, please. Thank you. And so one other thing just to flag for folks that's on our radar is an update on a prospective end of year tax bill. So members of Congress are hoping to attach an end of the year tax package to a final FY24 spending bill, whether that's the January 19th deadline or the February 2nd deadline remains to be seen. But we are urging Congress to include reforms outlined in the Bipartisan Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act in any end of the year tax bill. More specifically, that refers to reforms that would make the low-income housing tax credit better able to serve extremely low-income households and better able to serve rural and tribal areas as well. I think that is it. If I could get the next slide. Perfect. Thank you so much to everybody for joining today. Our next call is going to be on December 18th, and that will of course be our last call of the year. So please tune in for that. And until then, stay safe. We'll look forward to speaking with you again, and take care. Thanks, everyone.